The Dawgs fall just short on their comeback against Stanford. The Seahawks prep to host the New York Football Giants and previewing the MLS Western Conference Final. Let's take it around the sound. Hello and welcome to episode 24, it now is, of Around the Sound. I was going to post and record this episode early. We'll have a Sunday morning episode of Around the Sound, but we had a matinee afternoon college football game between the Dawgs and the Cardinal, UW versus Stanford. I figured I'd go ahead, watch that game, and break it down, get a game review on this Saturday episode of Around the Sound. That way, for next week's Wednesday episode of Around the Sound, we'll be able to review and break down both the Seahawks weekend game that we'll preview in this episode and the Sounders game on Monday, the MLS Western Conference Final against Minnesota. We'll talk about all those things in episode 24 of Around the Sound, but before we do that, I want to make sure all of you are following me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas and the podcast on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. Like I mentioned, we have new episodes of Around the Sound every Wednesday and Saturday, so make sure you follow that Instagram account to don't miss a beat around here. As always, you can watch every episode of Around the Sound on YouTube at PTOM Media, that's PTHOM space media, or you can listen to Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. Let's hop into the Huskies first, the game we saw on Saturday afternoon, the matinee game against the Stanford Cardinal. Another really horrible first half for UW. Jimmy Lake and the offense especially did not find their way into the end zone, went into the half down 24-3. If you recall, just a week ago in the Utah game, the Huskies were down 0-21 heading into the halftime locker room, were able to mount an incredible comeback, a game-winning drive late in that game. Unfortunately, the defense just could not make one more stop in this game against the Stanford Cardinal, and the Huskies offense never saw the field, never with a chance to have a game-winning drive. That's the best game I've seen Stanford play all year. I know David Shaw had been under a lot of pressure, and the Stanford football program had dipped a little bit from where they were a few years ago in the Christian McCaffrey era, and before that, the Andrew Luck era. But Stanford really did not make too many mistakes in that game, and they were able to grind down the Huskies front seven with the run game, hit them in the play action passing game in the second half once that started opening up. In the first half, it was a lot of power running, I formation, bigger linemen, bigger guys, and were able to dominate the line of scrimmage. It was a similar story to what the Huskies had faced in the Oregon State game, where Oregon State kept that game close because they were able to run the football on the Huskies. And you saw it in the first half in the Utah game as well. That power running I formation beat that Huskies front seven by having bigger guys on the line. Stanford's quarterback had plenty of poise out there. He looked a little bit like a vintage Andrew Luck. He wasn't forced to do too many great things with his arm, but he did have several great throws. But the biggest story coming out of this game is the second straight game with a really poor first half showing, a really horrific start. You can't always come back in the second half. It is not a viable strategy for a winning football team to go into the halftime locker room down 3 touchdowns each and every game. Dylan Morris and Jimmy Lake need to find out how to get the offense moving faster. Clearly, the coaching staff, the offensive coordinator, Donovan, they're starting to trust Morris and his arm more and more as the season goes on, and we're seeing Dylan Morris develop more and more as the season goes on and get more comfortable with the play calling, with the offense, with the playbook. But we need to figure out, I'm trying to figure out how the Huskies are going to translate that into getting more first half points. Morris and the offense finally got rolling in the second half, got back to the normal swing of things, but this is the second straight game where it was a first half dull offense where they were stifled at the line, could not get anything done. And the difference between last week's game against Utah, where the Dawgs were able to mount a comeback and leave out on top, and this game where the Huskies fell just short at the end, is that the defense could not make enough impact plays to put the game within reach. We saw the defense punch and punch and punch against Utah last week and not give up a single second half point. Unfortunately, Stanford came out and got a touchdown in the first drive of the second half that sort of iced the game. It didn't, since the Huskies were able to come back and put the game within reach, but it was ultimately that last touchdown that got Stanford up to that 31-10 lead after the Huskies, scored on their first second half possession. The biggest story on the defensive side of the ball was not being able to get off the field in third downs. The Stanford offense couldn't seem to be slowed down. They were 6 for 7 on third downs in the first half, and a lot of it was run plays. You normally think of third downs as getting offenses into third and mediums, third and longs, sort of third and 6 and above. Stanford was facing third and 2 to third and 6 a lot throughout the day, but it was runs most of the time where they were picking up the chains, and that's not what you're normally seeing on a third down. It's normally a short pass, a screen, or a slant route type of scheme. The Huskies couldn't seem to stop Stanford in the run game or when they did have to pass. That was why the Huskies offense ultimately did not have enough time of possession in the first half or enough chances to score in the second half, since the defense could not get off the field. Stanford scored on each of their first 5 possessions within the ball game, the first 4 coming in the first half, totaling up to 24 points, 3 touchdowns and a field goal, and Stanford also scoring on their first drive of the second half to Stanford's total 31 points, which they finished with at the end of the game. What this loss means in the long run, it takes the Huskies out of college football playoff running. Now, it was a long shot to begin with. I mentioned it on the earlier week, this week episode of Around the Sound. I probably shouldn't have mentioned it. It was a long shot to begin with, but this loss doesn't just take the Huskies out of the college football playoff running, but for all of the reasons that I mentioned on last week's episode or earlier in this week's episode, due to USC's COVID problems, due to Oregon's loss against Oregon State. This takes the entire Pac-12 out of the college football playoff running. Every team in the Pac-12 now has a loss, except for USC. They are the one team remaining. But due to COVID, due to cancellations, it seems like a long shot that they would be able to make the college football playoff. Outside of that, the loss does not hurt UW too much. It doesn't take them out of the running for the Pac-12 North. The most important game on the schedule was that Oregon game. The Oregon game next week. Both UW and Oregon are now sitting at 3-1, and that game next weekend essentially decides the Pac-12 North. The winner will come out of that game 4-1 and advance to play most likely USC. They play Washington State this weekend, USC, in the Pac-12 championship game. The winner of that game will most likely advance to the Rose Bowl or a big bowl game. The rest of the Pac-12 teams probably into some moderate or smaller bowl games. The winner of the Pac-12 championship going to be the only Pac-12 team that has a chance at winning a decent bowl game this year. Let's move on to the Seahawks now. Stephen Hauschka, the first piece of news we have to get to that's Seahawk related, has hung up his cleats. He has retired after a 13-year NFL career, mostly with the Seahawks and Bills. A really impressive career for Stephen Hauschka. 33 of 35 for his field goals in 2013. Of course, that being the year that the Seahawks were able to win the Super Bowl 48. I know there was a memorable moment that's come out on Twitter. There was an article written about it in the 2013 NFC Championship game between the Seahawks and the 49ers. The game with the infamous Sherman tipped it back to Malcolm Smith that iced the game. Then you had all the controversy following that play between Sherman and Crabtree. You got Richard Sherman's interview after the game. This memorable moment for Stephen Hauschka within this game was on the drive before the 49ers got the ball. The Seahawks were down 1, right outside, right on the edge of field goal range. It was windy. Pete Carroll, 4th and 7, decides to kick the field goal, or goes over to Stephen Hauschka and asks him, "Hey, Stephen, should we kick the field goal here?" And Hauschka looked at Pete, said, "Nah, man, it's windy. I can't make this field goal. You got to go for it here. I don't care if it's 4th and 7. You got to go for it here." On the ensuing play or the ensuing drive, Russell Wilson fires a touchdown to Jermaine Kearse. That puts the Seahawks up 6, and the rest is history after the 49ers try to drive. You have the Richard Sherman tip, which led the Seahawks to their first ever Super Bowl. Congratulations to Stephen Hauschka on a memorable career. Hausch money, as all of the 12s call him, and the Bills Mafia call him. I'm sure he will enjoy retirement. 4-7. That is what the Giants are leading the NFC East with. The New York Football Giants travel to Seattle this weekend, this Sunday, to play the Seahawks. Danny Dimes, Daniel Jones, the quarterback for the New York Giants, still injured. He's doubtful, so the Giants are expected to start Colt McCoy under center. Defense should feast again, similar to last week against the Eagles, Philadelphia Eagles, an offense that was somewhat dysfunctional with a quarterback in Carson Wentz who hasn't looked what he was in previous years, turning the ball over several times. Colt McCoy is also a sort of mediocre quarterback. He's not one of the guys in the league that's going to light up your defense for 300, 400 yards. He's no Aaron Rodgers. He's no Patrick Mahomes. The defense should be able to get to Colt McCoy with a Giants offensive line that also has its own share of problems. And of course, lead running back, the main part of the New York offense, is out as well. In my opinion, the only way that the Giants are able to stay in this game is if they run all over the Seahawks. And the good news for the Seahawks is the run defense has been somewhat decent all year and gotten better recently, stifling against the Eagles last weekend, sort of average to above average in the earlier part of the season. Most of the problems for the Seahawks defense have all come in the passing game. Before the Eagles game, on pace to give up the most passing yards in a season in NFL history. Now you have Wayne Gallman as the main back for the New York Giants with Saquon Barkley going out earlier in the year. He'll take the majority of the carries. He's had a productive last few weeks, but he's not the same runner that a Saquon Barkley type running back is. He's not the same threat, not the same weapon. So without QB1, without RB1, it should be a relatively easy or simple game for the Seattle defense as long as they avoid those big mistakes. I know Darius Slayton, the wide receiver one for the New York Giants, also battling some injuries, may not be 100% for this game. So if they're missing QB1, the Giants are missing running back one and wide receiver one. It seems really, really difficult to believe that this Giants offense will be able to stomp all over the much improving Seahawks defense this week, especially coming off a great game against the Eagles last week. Let's talk about for injuries on this Seahawks side of the ball. Relatively healthy coming out of Monday Night Football. Brandon Shell, right tackle, picked up an injury. O-line depth has not been a huge issue so far for the Seahawks. Jamarco Jones and the other guys who have been able to step into that Seahawks offensive line have done a relatively good job this year at keeping the defensive line at bay. Outside of really the Rams game, Russell Wilson has not faced too much pressure. In recent weeks, he's had time and ability to throw, has not fumbled the ball or had any strip sacks. Defensive lines have not been able to tee off on Russell Wilson quite like they did in the Rams game or like we saw the Seahawks offense of 2016-17 when the offensive line was really poor. Trey Flowers, who played much, much better last week against the Eagles, starting to show he actually belongs on this defense, belongs in the NFL. I know a lot of Seahawks fans were waiting for him to sort of turn the corner on what was a poor 2019 season and a poor start to the 2020 season. Trey Flowers, a good game last week, came out of the game with a little bit of a tight hamstring. He will most likely be out. Quinton Dunbar still on IR. He will also be out. That means that DJ Reed will have the starting role at corner opposite of Pro Bowler Shaquille Griffin. Carlos Dunlap listed questionable for this game. Pete Carroll said to the media later in the week that he thinks Carlos Dunlap should be and will be available for this game. If he's out, a decent blow to the Seahawks D-line, but the D-line has been continuing to shift different guys in and out of those defensive line spots for different snaps. Colt McCoy, the defensive line should still do damage against him and the Giants O-line, which has allowed plenty of sacks this year. This is a big opportunity for the Seahawks defense. This can be a turning point in the season for the Seahawks defense. We're coming off of 2 games of seeing the Seahawks defense start to improve, not just on paper with the pass yardage count, but actually making impact plays that are winning the Seahawks games. 2 weeks ago on Thursday Night Football against the Cardinals, Carlos Dunlap, the game-clinching sack, the ice of the sack that put the game on ice is what I should say. But you saw the defense play great against Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, Kenyon Drake, Larry Fitzgerald, all of those weapons in Arizona. On Monday Night Football last week, the Seahawks defense came back and stifled the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles finished with 17 points, but that included a Hail Mary late on in that game. Other than that Hail Mary, the Eagles did not have a first down for the first quarter and a half of that game. The Seahawks defense started to look dominant for parts of both of those games. The end of the Cardinals game, the first quarter and a half of the Eagles game. This is a big turning point. This is a big opportunity for the Seahawks defense to go against yet another dysfunctional, below average offense in the NFL and really dominate. A classic 2013-esque defense performance. That 2013 Seahawks defense was a defense that allowed an average of 13 points per game to opposing offenses. I think that should be a reasonable goal for the Seahawks defense this week. Keeping the New York Giants offense to 13 points or less, stifling the run game, not allowing Colt McCoy to top 200, 250 yards in the pass game. This is an opportunity for the defense to establish themselves as being capable of taking over games and being dominant. Over the course of this season, especially in the first few weeks, what you saw is the Seahawks defense being dominated by the opposing offense and having Russell Wilson and his arm having to bail out the defense in shootout style games. In the last few weeks, the Seahawks offense has adapted to more of a slower running style, not putting as much pressure on Russell Wilson because he started to throw so many picks in the middle part of that season. The Cardinals game, the first Cardinals game down in Arizona, against the Rams, against the Buffalo Bills, the 3 Seahawk losses. After that, Pete Carroll, the offense, Russell Wilson started to shift their mentality, shorten the game, shift to more of a running game, which means the Seahawks defense will have more rest on the sidelines. It'll be a slightly shorter game. That also adds to the opportunity, to the ease of opportunity for the Seahawks defense to really pounce on this New York Giants offense that, again, is missing Daniel Jones, their quarterback, missing Saquon Barkley, who's out for the year with an ACL, could be missing Darius Slayton, or Darius Slayton could be limited in this game, that wide receiver one. Really big opportunity for the Seahawks defense to come out, dominate from the first whistle to the last whistle, and hold the New York Giants offense to maybe even single-digit points. Can't lose this one. Can't lose versus the Jets. This is the easiest part of the schedule, easiest part of the year for the Seahawks. The Giants are leading the division at 4-7, but they're a 4-7 team. After this week, the Seahawks then host the Jets, who are undoubtedly the worst team in the NFL, sitting at 0-11. This is an opportunity for the Seahawks to go from 8-3 to 10-3 if they want to stay in the race for that number 1 seed in the NFC. These should be 2 cakewalk games. You don't have too much trouble getting through them, and the Seahawks should be able to coast through both of these New York teams that have had significant struggles throughout this year. We'll have to see what happens on Sunday. A big opportunity in my eyes for the defense. I'll certainly be watching them to see a dominant performance. Russ, don't expect him to put up MVP caliber numbers. We'll talk about the MVP race in a minute. Seahawks are going to go back to that running style that we saw against the Philadelphia Eagles and a little bit against the Cardinals. Chris Carson is continuing to get healthier. He got 8 touches last week. Expect Chris Carson to get more of the load in this game. Carlos Hyde will also get a decent amount of the load as well. Another piece of Seahawks news that we got this week will not impact either of the games against the Giants or the Jets, but following those games, Josh Gordon is finally being reinstated by the league to play in weeks 16 and 17, the last 2 games of the year for the Seahawks, being the 49ers and the Rams respectively. And here, look, the way I see it, if players like Antonio Brown are playing, Josh Gordon should be able to play. The NFL has finally started to step away from the marijuana issue and are starting to let players rehab by using marijuana. They've gotten a lot more lenient on the rules. They were strict for a very, very long time. And Josh Gordon, who's been suspended 8 different times in the NFL, hasn't had any other real trouble than weed. He clearly has some sort of an addiction that he can't get over, and the NFL's rules, or the old NFL's rules that restricted him from doing any of that kind of activity, he couldn't fit into those rules. He could not fit into that mold. He never had any other trouble. It didn't affect his play on the field or his relationships with his teammates. Part of the reason the NFL started to lax on their rules and shift away from those rules is ex-players, players that retired. I know Gronk was also part of this conversation. Those players were trying to lead the NFL into changing their rules because of how great that drug can be in rehabbing some of these players after they're getting hit week after week after week. I see a lot of people try to lump Josh Gordon into a group as some AB type, or lump him into a group with Ray Rice, as terrible as that sounds. And I don't mean that he's done the same things or acted in the same ways that those players have, but people tend to lump Josh Gordon in those kinds of groups as a player that continues to get suspended by the NFL and won't follow the rules and is a rebel who will never find a successful career in the NFL. The NFL had rules, weed rules, outlined that he simply could not follow throughout his career. He's been a fantastic football player back in 2013, 2014, before he went through this long string of suspensions. The NFL has laxed their rules. The name of the game has changed in the NFL considering weed. Now that the rules have laxed, now that the rules have changed, he seems determined. Russell Wilson, Pete Carroll should be able to keep him on track. It's really too bad that his career did not come 10 years later. He could have had a great long career at wide receiver in the NFL with these lax rules. He's starting to get into the twilight years of his career now, certainly past his prime, which we saw on the Browns in 2013, 2014. He'll have an opportunity to get far into the playoffs potentially with the Seahawks this year. Who knows what Josh Gordon's future looks like after this year with the Seahawks. We'll have to see how he performs in week 16, 17, and pushing on into the playoffs, assuming the Seahawks get there. Could be another deadly weapon for Russ heading into the more important games of the season, those divisional games in week 16, 17, and of course the playoff games, which will follow that. Could make the Seahawks offense even more deadly. How much of a pop does Josh Gordon still have left in him? He's been working out, but it has been 6-7 years since he's been really a dynamic, dominant receiver in the NFL. We saw Josh Gordon play a few games for the Seahawks last year, make a couple great catches, but overall wasn't a dominant force in the 2019 season, quite like he was in the 2013-2014 season, which can be expected, but could certainly be an intricate part of this offense in third down situations, important catches when Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf are being double teamed in those playoff type scenarios. Let's shift into the MVP race, because I know I haven't touched on the MVP race in a while for Russell Wilson. So how is Russell Wilson doing in that MVP race? Well, is it a three-player race? I know there's been some names thrown out. A three-player race between Patrick Mahomes of the Chiefs, Aaron Rodgers of the Packers, and Russell Wilson of the Seahawks. All similar statistics. If you look at the statistics between Mahomes, Rodgers, Wilson, the passing yards between those three guys are probably all within 200 yards. Touchdowns are within 3 touchdowns. I think Rodgers is leading the pack with 33. Mahomes and Wilson 30 and 31. Unfortunately, the big statistic, the glaring statistic that sets these three quarterbacks apart from each other goes against Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson has 10 interceptions on the year. Mahomes only 2. Rodgers only 4. Interceptions are really killing his chances and keeping him from being at the top of this conversation. Now, the midpoint in the season, week 8, everybody had kind of unanimously picked Russell Wilson as the MVP for the at least the midpoint in the season, but Russell's really dropped off since that middle point. The Seahawks have also been switching to more of a run-based offense after Russell Wilson started to throw more of those picks, which may be helping the Seahawks guide the Seahawks to more wins, but isn't helping Russell Wilson's MVP chances, particularly. In a Mahomes-style offense where it's an air raid offense, you have Tyreek Hill, you have Travis Kelce, all of those weapons, you're going to continue to throw the ball, and you're going to continue to see Andy Reid be comfortable with Mahomes airing out the ball 50 times a game. Unfortunately, Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson aren't as comfortable with letting Russ cook quite as much as we saw earlier in the year, the first 5-6 weeks of the season, where Russell Wilson was topping over 40 throws per game. Russ has dropped to third in this race behind Mahomes and Rodgers, not just because of those interceptions, but now he's not able to put up as many yards, as many touchdowns on the board, since the Seahawks have resulted to relying more on Carlos Hyde, relying more on Chris Carson, rushing touchdowns, and slowing down the game. When Russell Wilson's only throwing 25 to 30 passes a game, when you have Mahomes and Rodgers topping 40 passes a game almost every single week, it's really, really difficult to see Russell Wilson keeping pace with those guys as far as yardage goes, as far as touchdowns goes, and I don't see Mahomes and Rodgers tossing a bunch of picks that puts Russ back into the name of the game for the MVP between now and the end of the year. With an easy schedule coming forward for the Seahawks, you have the New York Giants, you have the Jets, you have the Washington football team. It means that Russ won't have to make as many draw-dropping plays. The Seahawks should be up for a majority of all three of those games. You're going to see more of a run-dominant style offense in all of those games. In the last 2 games of the year, 49ers in week 16, the Rams in week 17, you will see Russ have to make more of those plays because both of those teams are a little bit tougher than the NFC East teams plus the Jets that you have on the Seahawks schedule coming up. Russell Wilson will be able to rack up more passing yards, more touchdowns in those 2 games, but at this point in the season, it's looking more and more like a Mahomes or Rodgers type of an MVP year. I assume that those guys will continue to put up great numbers going down the stretch. Avoid throwing multiple amounts of interceptions like we saw from Russell Wilson sort of in the middle part of that Seahawks year with the Cardinals, with the Bills, with the Rams. Could be Mahomes or Rodgers. My money's on Mahomes at this point because I think he has a little better weapons around him. Tyreek Hill absolutely went off against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last weekend. I had him in my fantasy team, 56 points at least. That's how I'm keeping score. Hope you guys did as well. Hope you weren't going against him because he went off. Looking like a Mahomes or Rodgers MVP year, like a long shot for Russell Wilson now. Same story as 2019. Russell Wilson probably the favorite 8 weeks in a 3-horse race with Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. And similar to the 2020 season, in 2019, Russell Wilson just happened to drop off sort of in the second half of that season, the middle part of that season, that allowed it to become Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes' award, Lamar Jackson winning it at the end of the 2019 season. We'll have to see what happens on Sunday with the Seahawks. On Monday, we have the conference final set for the MLS Western Conference. The Sounders will host Minnesota United, the Sounders being the 2 seed, Minnesota United being the 4 seed. Minnesota United coming off a very, very impressive performance earlier this week, 3-0 against Sporting Kansas City. Reynoso, Kevin Molino, two of their most dangerous weapons going forward, absolutely dazzling against Minnesota United in the middle of the week. Minnesota United, over the course of the season, their biggest issues had lied going forward and on the attacking end. The number 10 position, that central attacking midfielder who's going to sit behind the number 9 striker, was one of their weakest points at the beginning of the year. They pick up Reynoso in the middle of the season from Boca Juniors in Argentina. He joins the squad, gels really well. Kevin Molino's on form right now. He's on form right now. Robin Lode, a good solid striker up there, number 9. Stellar defense, Minnesota. Always had a stellar defense throughout the course of the year. The biggest problem was, could Minnesota United score goals in that night, traveling to top-seeded SKC earlier in this week, in the middle of the week. Really, really impressive performance. If Minnesota gets out to a lead, they have an incredible, incredible ability to lock up games and keep the opposition from having any chances in front of goal. They went into the halftime locker room up 3-0 in Kansas City, and Sporting, one of the best attacking teams in the Western Conference in the second half, Minnesota completely locked them down. Sporting Kansas City had absolutely no chances to break free, no opportunities on goal in that second half. Another big note from Minnesota United is longtime Sounders fans will know that Ozzie Alonso leads Minnesota as sort of that number 6 holding midfielder that sits in front of the defensive line. We'll have a little bit of a revenge game there. Ozzie Alonso, of course, the intricate part of the Sounders midfield, that engine room for the Sounders from 2009 to 2018. He leaves and joins Minnesota United. The Sounders brought in João Paulo to sort of replace Ozzie Alonso. Ozzie Alonso didn't leave here because he was angry or wanted to leave Seattle. The front office decided that he was getting older and it was his time to go. Because of that, I know Ozzie Alonso still has plenty of love for the Sounders, plenty of love for the city, but you know that he will want to be able to prove to the front office that he can still do it, and they probably shouldn't have let him go. Expect a spirited performance, a revenge game for Ozzie Alonso. That'll certainly be fun to watch. Two big missing pieces for Minnesota United in this game. Ike Opara, the center back, the defender of the year for MLS in 2019, and Tyler Miller, their goalkeeper. You might recognize that name because he did back up Stephen Fry here in Seattle a few years ago. Both of those pieces were missing. It did not really cost Minnesota United in that Sporting Kansas City game, but between Nico Lodeiro, Raul Ruiz-Diaz, Jordan Morris, sort of the big three going forward for the Sounders, I think they will be able to find ways through and test Minnesota's backup goalkeeper and backup center back who is playing in front or instead of Ike Opara. The offense going forward is going to have to play better than they did in that game against FC Dallas. In the gritty 1-0 win against FC Dallas, the conference semifinal, it took a corner, a set-piece goal for Shane O'Neill, the center back who has not scored in the MLS since 2014, to win it for the Sounders. It's got to be the Stars against Minnesota who have to get it done. It has to be moments of brilliance for Nico Lodeiro, for Raul Ruiz-Diaz, for Jordan Morris. Similar to the game in the conference final last year against LAFC. Unlike LAFC, Minnesota are more of a defense-first based kind of team, while LAFC was an attacking-first based kind of team, but it's still going to take those magic moments from those big three up front for the Seattle Sounders to really make things happen, really make it interesting, and to beat to beat Minnesota and find ways through. If Minnesota scores and leads at halftime or leads for a significant portion of the game, it's exceedingly difficult in the kind of form that Minnesota are in right now because they're so dangerous up top, but especially because of how well they can sit back and lock down games, play a possession-based style where they're really playing slow build-up, wasting time. it's really difficult to fight back into games when Minnesota gets up. Sporting Kansas City were down and out after Minnesota scored their second goal in the middle portion of the first half. They had 65 minutes to try to work themselves back into that game, conceded one more before halftime, and like I mentioned, had absolutely no opportunities in the second half. Minnesota locked that game up. If the Sounders score first, they put themselves in a really favorable position for Minnesota to continue to push further forward. When Minnesota push further forward, there are opportunities for the Sounders to work in behind and score more. If Minnesota scores first, they are put in a massive, massive advantage to be able to lock up the game and get a gritty 1-0 win and advance to MLS Cup. Whoever scores first in this game is who I have going through to the MLS Cup. Monday night, winner advances to the MLS Cup. Seattle has been in 3 of the last 4 MLS Cups in 2016, 17, and 19, all against Toronto FC, who have been eliminated in this year's playoffs. In the Eastern Conference Final is New England Revolution against the Columbus Crew. One of those 2 teams will also advance to the MLS Cup as we get into the later window of these MLS Cup playoffs. But man, have the MLS Cup playoffs been really, really fun to watch this year. There's been a lot of late winners, a lot of really exciting results, a lot of really impressive results, including that 3-0 win for Minnesota. Should be a really great game on Monday. I'm certainly looking forward to the Western Conference Final. All right, guys. Well, that's all we had to cover today on Around the Sound. We got through a little bit of a Sounders preview, a Seahawks preview, and of course, this episode comes a little bit later. We're recording after that matinee UW-Stanford game. UW takes their first loss of the year, will most likely drop out of the AP poll and the coaches poll, being ranked only 22 before that game kicked off. Next week is the big one for the Huskies against Oregon. Winner of that game advancing to the Pac-12 championship game. Next week on Around the Sound, we'll have episodes, as always, on Wednesday and Saturday. That Wednesday episode, we'll be able to break down how UW will match up against Oregon next weekend. We'll also be able to review both the Western Conference Final for the Sounders and the Seahawks game against the New York Football Giants. Plenty of stuff coming up. Don't miss a beat. It's going to continue to get more exciting as we get later into this year and push towards 2021. Lots of sports, lots of stuff that's going to happen before then. So I will see you guys on Wednesday. Stay safe and thanks for listening.